Hey, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining in today's webinar entitled Come Let Us Reason Together as we tell some stories of Farmers Union conventions. My name is Mike Strands and I'm the Vice President of Advocacy for National Farmers Union. Ever since our organization's founding in 1902, Farmers Union members have been gathering for almost 120 years. So now, while this year's national convention has been moved to an online format due to the pandemic, this is far from the first time our organization has weathered big challenges or had to overcome adversity. It's really what we're all about. Today's webinar will help us remember how Farmers Union meetings have unfolded through the years. It'll help us to appreciate the value and remember how important it is that we join together, either in the real world or online. We'll hear from two experts on this, NFU historian Tom Giesel of Kansas and Wisconsin Farmers Union Education Director Kathy Stotts. Before we get started, I would just like to note a few housekeeping items of business. This webinar is one in a series of virtual programming that's been taking place in advance of our national convention. A schedule and recording of these virtual programming events can be found on our website. Now that you've registered for this webinar, you're also registered for the event this afternoon on climate-focused rural development, which starts at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. That also means you're registered for the final two sessions, which will occur next Friday, February 26th. Let's see, so our panelists will be taking questions at the end of this webinar, so please feel free to ask those questions using the Q&A box in the bottom of your Zoom application. And if you have any technical questions or issues, feel free to ask those using the chat box, and an NFU staff member will gladly assist. Also, you'll note that this webinar is being recorded, so if you'd like to watch it again or share it with others, you'll be able to find a link on our convention webpage in the next day or two. And lastly, if you're unfamiliar with National Farmers Union, our mission is to advocate for family farmers and ranchers through education, legislation, and cooperation. We work to ensure that farm families and their communities are respected, valued, and enjoy economic prosperity and social justice. All attendees, especially any first-time participants, are encouraged to visit our website, www.nfu.org, and explore the opportunities we have to get involved. So with that, let's get started. Again, I'll turn it over to our two distinguished panelists, NFU historian Tom Giesel from Kansas and Wisconsin Farmers Union Education Director Kathy Stotts. Tom and Kathy.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Thank you, everybody, for spending your day with us. Yeah, Mike pretty well covered what we're going to do. I just want to say that, principally, we're going to talk about national conventions, but we'll talk about a couple state conventions, the very beginnings of conventions, the evolution, hopefully some of the quirks and shenanigans that were pulled, and kind of reflect on its purpose, and we'll have a handful of stories along the way. Did you want to add anything else, Kathy, before I start?
No, I think other than maybe just we should introduce ourselves a little bit. I'll start since I'm talking. As the education director for Wisconsin Farmers Union, I also run the cooperative summer camp program here at Camp Kenwood in Wisconsin and help out with the National Farmers Union College Conference on Cooperatives program. And I grew up in the Farmers Union education program, so I had the pleasure of attending both state and national conventions, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But it's really a lot of fun to be on this webinar with Tom, whom I've known since, I don't know, the Nashville convention in the year that I can't remember. But we're really glad to be with you today. So Tom, you want to share a little bit about your background? Oh, and I grew up on a dairy farm in central Wisconsin. So I grew up in the Farmers Union as a member.
Sure, I'm a full-time farmer, farmed all my life with the exception of 1 year. After I got my degree in geology, I worked as a geologist for a year. But I came back to the farm. Pretty deep Farmers Union roots. Actually, I've traced back to, for sure, a great uncle, a great uncle of mine who joined Kansas Farmers Union in 1908. So, yeah, it goes a long way, and it's a great organization. So, with that, why don't we go ahead and roll to the next slide, our first slide. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about our title, that "Come Let Us Reason Together." Of course, that obviously is biblical in nature or origin, but also the early People's Party and Populist, which Farmers Union, and it was an outgrowth of the Farmers Alliance, used this slogan a lot. In fact, some of our newspapers, it was screamed along the headers about "Let us reason together." And our conventions, predate Farmers Union. Actually, we grew out of the ashes of the old Farmers Alliance, which is another story. That just real briefly, that banner, of course, that hangs in our national office, and a lot of people don't realize it was actually stitched together and made by Ludi Gresham, who was a daughter of our founder, and it represents the first Farmers Union local farm in the United States. And the symbolism there has a lot to do. The blue and the gray dove, with the north and the south coming together, and of course the live oak tree. So there's if you ever get a chance, it's a beautiful piece of work, and it was donated. It became property of the National Farmers Union in 1929 at the convention. Just a little side issue there. Let's try. We got a couple polls. Let's go to that slide, and then let's pop up that first poll if we can, concerning. I'd like you to see which city of these four has never hosted a Farmers Union convention. Choose between Oklahoma City, St. Louis, Missouri, Hot Springs, Arkansas, or Omaha. So if you kind of rapidly do that, if you want to, and we'll see what everybody says. While you're voting on that, I'll just say that there's been many obscure places where it's been held, including Salina, Kansas, but Palatka, Florida is one of my favorite stories of Farmers Union conventions in 1914. And that town still exists, and there was a reason we met there, but it was kind of a destination type convention. So Hot Springs, no, actually St. Louis, Missouri has never hosted a Farmers Union convention. Some of that has to do with the fact that we never did get real strong in Missouri because of an agreement we had with some others. So I have this panoramic picture in my house of the 1936 National Farmers Union Convention, which was held in Des Moines, Iowa, for no particular reason except it just kind of exemplifies what our conventions look like in the middle of our life as an organization. What I find interesting too in this particular picture, and you can't really tell it, but about 45% of the people are women, which I think is pretty fascinating. And there's another story I'll get to later about this particular convention. And let's do that second poll quick before I go any farther. And I have a second one, which state in the United States has not hosted a National Farmers Union convention? South Dakota, Massachusetts, Indiana, or New York? So think about that one and vote. And then I'll make a few more. Well, I'll just comment that we have had conventions in 33 different states over the years, and as well as 4 in Washington, D.C. So, well, the answer is actually Indiana. We've had 2 in New York, one in New York City in 1963, and one a little bit later in Rochester, New York. So yeah, it surprised me too. I figured Indiana of all places, but it never has. The state, well, maybe I better not say it. It might be another question. We'll get to that later. But on the conventions, it's interesting. Let's see, I'll go back to my notes now. There's been 2 conventions, national conventions, postponed over the years. And the first one was in 1907. And in 1907, it was postponed because they were waiting until after the first frost. So I had to do a little research on this because we were mainly a Southern organization. And anyway, the reason they were waiting until after first frost was because yellow fever was an issue and they wanted to get all the mosquitoes killed. So they put it back. And the second one, of course, was postponed in 1918, which obviously a Spanish flu pandemic, which we know so much about, which has a lot to do with where we're at today. Our Kansas Farmers Union president had talked about that back in 1918 in our Farmers Union paper. And I like his quote, and I think it would still be true today if you were talking about today's situation. And I'll just read it. He says, and this is Morris McCullough, little Irishman, "The infernal influenza is knocking our plans of holding Farmers Union meetings endways. But if it gives us the go-by in every respect, we will excuse it for upsetting our meeting. We can rearrange our meeting dates after this pesky thing quits, if we are in the land of the living. But if we are stowed away in the great beyond, well, the meetings won't concern us." So it's interesting how time goes around and around. Farmers Unions had a couple of changes of venues in the short term. And one of them was in 1915. I don't want to get too boring on you on this, but it's kind of interesting too. It was scheduled to be in San Francisco, and it got moved to Omaha, Nebraska. And the other one in 1990, I don't know why this is always a Nebraska thing, but we were scheduled to be in Omaha, and Initiative 300, the corporate farm law, was on the ballot, and the Omaha Chamber of Commerce was supporting corporate farming. So we pulled out and moved to Oklahoma City. So, and then the other thing about conventions, the reason we call it like this year, the 100, and I don't know what it is, 117th anniversary, I believe, convention, is because we haven't had a convention every year. From 1947 to 1957, we alternated every other year between having a convention and what we call the leadership conference, which was where on the off years and the odd numbered years, we went there and we trained specifically in leadership areas for our own communities as adults and as youth too. And it was a very powerful tool. So conventions are a strange thing. Different times of year, they move them around, so on and so forth. But okay, let's go to the next slide. And this is a picture or a photo of what was known as the ritual. The Farmers Union was very ritualistic in nature at first. We had secret meetings, we had locked doors, we had passwords to get into the meeting. Only farmers could attend. And that will lead to a few stories later, but yeah, we met behind locked doors, and some of that was just, for lack of better words, kind of paranoia, but not really. There was people eavesdropping, there was people spying, there was people trying to figure out what our next move was, so they just closed the door. In the 1917, we did away with the ritual and went to the Constitution bylaws, which is a manual of sorts. And part of the reason was because some of the churches, including the Catholic Church, which I'm a member of, by the way, would not allow people to join because it was of the ritualistic nature of the organization. And there's another story for another time, another program on this ritual thing, and it's really fascinating. I'd like to do it at another national convention sometime when we meet in person. Let's go on to the next slide. And this actually is, and I have this on a microfilm, it's kind of a fluke that I have it, but out of the Kansas Farmers Union newspaper. This was the delegate body of the very first convention that met with national convention. Even though we were founded in 1902, we never became a national organization until 1906. And from 1904 to 1906, we had 7 conventions to try to get this thing ironed out. And it really wasn't a smooth operation. There was at one point where Texas thought they had it all and they didn't want to give it up. And we actually elected 2 sets of national officers. So we had the schism, which I think is kind of an interesting story. Because within all this unity, and we have a lot of unity, and there was also a lot of diversity and diversity of opinion. So at this point, I want to flip it over to Kathy and let her talk a little bit on the early conventions as we move through this. Kathy?
Thanks, Tom. So, part of that diversity of ideas, part of it was a diversity of ideas, part of it was diversity of attendees. And so I wanted to share a little bit about the Fort Worth Convention in 1908 and the role of women there. From early in our organization's history, women were a part and were a voting part, as youth were. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but at this particular convention in 1908, I think it's notable that over half of the speakers on the docket, on the program for that event, were women. And it was at this convention that we saw that delegate status was recognized, and that in fact there were some husband-wife delegate teams, which continues today to be very common at both the state and national level. You see there in the corner a photo of the 1950 National Leadership Conference. This is what Tom was just speaking about, where in the opposite years, for a number of years, there were these training sessions, and you'll note it's a significant number of women. And we thought it would be interesting to share this quote from Samuel Gompers. He, being the first and longest serving president of the American Federation of Labor, AFL, he was in attendance at that 1908 convention and spoke, including this quote: "We may be engaged in some material progress in life, but until a woman gives her support, her principles, her activity, no great movement can be made a success." I thought this was interesting to share and to speak just for a little bit about this notion of labor and of women's involvement. Labor from the perspective that they were very present at these early conventions. There was a lot of commonality there in terms of the work that was being done. You can find a lot of amazing old cartoons in the old Farmers Union papers about farmers and labor working together. In fact, in Wisconsin, where we built a summer camp facility to do cooperative education back in the late 1940s, the single largest contribution was from the Wisconsin AFL-CIO, $1,000 in the late 1940s. That was a significant contribution. And so you can see that the relationship has been very strong over the years between those two. The education side, there were one of 22 committees that were established at that convention, and the role of women was pretty important in the education work. But I want to mention for a moment how this connection in Farmers Union with the role and the voice of women really echoes the cooperative movement and things that were established 60 years prior, especially in the UK and the consumer cooperative movement. And so I wanted to share this excerpt from an abstract on women in the consumer co-op space that, and because it connected with labor, it notes that traditionally the labor movement associated with male workers and issues of wages and production. In contrast, the cooperative movement is concerned with issues of prices and consumption, with the main source of financial support for the retailing societies, that is to say the early consumer co-ops, coming from the female consumer, the so-called woman with the basket. And in the background image there, you see one of the historic banners from the Women's Cooperative Guild featuring just that, and the rainbow, which was associated with the cooperative movement because of inclusivity being featured. So many of you have heard of Rochdale, sort of considered the beginning of the modern cooperative movement, not the beginning of cooperatives, of course. And in 1844, their rules stated that anyone could join the cooperative society provided they were over 16 years of age. Each member was entitled to one vote, whatever the amount of their shareholding, and it was explicitly stated that men and women would enjoy equal voting rights within the society. Cooperative societies prided themselves on equality of rights for all members and equality of access through open membership. And I just want to mention that because it absolutely, you see that those parameters of membership in our own organization, some 60 years later, and it's clear the link between what was being discovered in the very urban consumer cooperative space influencing rural cooperatives and the rural farm organizations. And that made a lot of sense. Some of the earliest co-ops, Tom was telling me, even in Farmers Union, were actually consumer co-ops because people largely produced what they could for their own consumption. It wasn't until farming got more efficient and farms got larger that the kind of producer co-ops became more prevalent. But this is clear then, in our conventions, this voice being played out in sort of an official way. Another part of this diversity that I want to talk about a little bit relates to, our sort of racial and cultural diversity. Tony DeShawn at the Denver Convention in 1948, there's this really great story. And Farmers Union leader Ruth Cobell, who passed away actually just last year in 2020 at the age of 102. She lived and recounted many stories of Farmers Union's progressive work over her 80 plus years involved with the organization, including incidentally how Jim Patton and Tony DeShawn worked with Miles and Zilphia, I never could say her name right, Zilphia Horton, at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee to develop an education program and organize cooperatives. And those of you who have an interest in the sort of popular education movement and the Highlander School, it's notable that there were early connections there with our organization's work. So this particular story related to the Denver Convention, either 1948 or 49, is just one of my favorites. And it's recounted here in Tony DeShawn's own words, and that is, I lost a battle with the Shirley Savoy Hotel in Denver when I tried to register 8 Blacks from Alabama. So I went to the YMCA in the downtown next door and I reserved a 12-bed dormitory. I made a down payment and I got a receipt. I asked for and got a letter acknowledging the reservation. 10 days before the convention, I casually mentioned to the clerk that there would be 8 Blacks. All hell broke loose. 3 downtown businessmen came to urge me to use the Black YMCA. I told them I was going to find out whether the word Christian in YMCA meant anything. It was a tough session. They finally said they would cancel the reservation. I told them to have at it and that I would go to the Denver Post, and I bet them $100 to $50 that I would make the front page. The Blacks stayed at the downtown YMCA. Some folks took a dim view of my blackjack tactics. I didn't give a damn. I did what had to be done. 6 months later, Black kids were swimming and playing basketball in the downtown YMCA. And this is really just one of many stories in our organization's history related to efforts around inclusion. I want to also share that in our 1940 All States Camp out in Colorado, the campers had donated the surplus funds of their camp co-op store, which is something that we do at all Farmers Union camps and have since the early days. They donated their surplus funds to the Legal Defense Fund of Clinton Clark, a Black organizer with the Louisiana Farmers Union who'd been arrested on false charges and feared lynching. And somehow the campers, well, I think there was a speaker at that All States camp who told them about his work and his plight. And so they donated their funds to his cause. And in another example, the Oklahoma Farmers Union supported a Lebanese immigrant medical doctor, Michael Shadid, even as this doctor received death threats for his organizing work, because they were working together to create a cooperative hospital in Elk City, Oklahoma. This became the model for a number of cooperatively owned medical systems today using the group health structure. So if you know group health out in the Puget Sound area or the one in Madison, Wisconsin, they came from this heritage. And there's a great quote too from the National Union Farmer in 1952 with this photo you see on the screen about the major emphasis being placed on learning to know our neighbors, not just as individuals, but to gain a knowledge of their problems and their countries. Camps, schools, and conventions in every state and at the national level invite guests from all parts of the United States and from every country, religion, and race. Represented at one All States camp were persons of 3 races, 9 countries, and 4 major religious groups: Christian, Jew, Muslim, and Buddhist. So with that, I want to turn things back over to Tom to share some other stories and some other notable examples of things that happened at some of our national conventions.
Thank you, Kathy. I think we'll put up our last poll. I have at national conventions, we've had many speakers over the years, and actually we've had presidents of the United States. So I listed 4, actually there's 5, but these 4 that could have addressed the Farmers Union national conventions: John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Gerald Ford, or Woodrow Wilson. So go ahead and vote. And since you're already voting, I'll say that actually Truman was another one that spoke to us, but it was after he was out of office, so I didn't put him on there. But which one did not address the convention? You're right. Absolutely. So we had all those. Gerald Ford, actually, he addressed our convention, but he wasn't president yet. The Woodrow Wilson actually wasn't at the national convention. He addressed the Kansas Farmers Union Convention in 1915. Okay, I got this montage of photos and I'll just briefly skim over them because I want to keep moving on here a little bit with some of this, but you might recognize some of these people. Over the years, we've had secretaries of agriculture, we've had everything. In the upper left, there is Dan Glickman in his younger days. That was before he's secretary. He was 4th District Congressman from Wichita, Kansas, and Cy Carpenter was our national president. So this would be in the late 1980s. The center top picture is Milo Reno. Milo Reno was Iowa Farmers Union president in the 1920s, also led the farm holiday movement with all the strikers. And then sitting in the background is Charles Barrett, one of our old presidents. But Milo Reno, and I guess when I put this up, we started to broadcast our national conventions when radio came out in the late 20s. And so the journalism and so on and so forth has really changed. The upper right is just a photo of a little bit, well, I'd say about 40 years ago. I think I got it covered up, but Alan Bergman's in that picture for North Dakota, who was one time our national vice president. Lower left, Charlie Branham, who was Secretary of Agriculture under Truman. After he finished with that job, he became our legal counsel, and actually he was Dave Velde followed Charlie Branham as legal counsel. And then in that lower right is the Farmers Union airplane, which we had, and we used the heck out of it for years and years. We'd fly people to conventions, do membership work, so on and so forth. And the really reason we got rid of it was it was continually grounded by the FFA, not for mechanical purposes, but probably political purposes. So that's all I'm really going to say about conventions. If somebody has some questions later on, we'll go on with that. So let's go to the next slide. You know, this is a slide I used in some other presentations, and it says, let the words be agitate, organize, educate, cooperate. And that was by president of the Indiana Farmers Union. By the way, prior to 1907, Oklahoma wasn't a state, so you had Indiana and Oklahoma. But it's kind of the calling for our conventions. By, you know, the term agitation means to stir up, to get people fired up, you know, and to organize. And our early presidents and presidents now are great organizers. And they want to do it in this particular order. They said we have to get people fired up, we have to organize. And by the way, Barrett says we need to organize our hearts as well as our minds, educate, and then only then can you cooperate. I think with that, you know, we're talking about farmers and their problems. There's a group that was called American Society of Equity that was a parallel group to us that joined up with us in 1932, I believe. But talk about farmers' problems being consistent and long bearing. I have one of their pamphlets, and it's on the front cover. It says "Farmers' Problems #3." So I always thought it was interesting that they numbered them. So I'm going to flip it back to Kathy and talk a little bit about conventions and education and so forth.
Thanks, Tom. There are a couple of kind of interesting stories, and I thought the previous slide that referred to that rallying cry of agitate, organize, educate, cooperate, which sort of a precursor to our notion of the Farmers Union triangle with education, cooperation, legislation, was sort of a good place to start. The Minnie Lovinger, I'm not sure, I know all the folks from South Dakota will know how to say her name, was really quite a hero in early education at the Farmers Union, the chair of the first standing committee on education, and really recognizing that importance of education, putting it at the base of the triangle once that symbol became known, and embedding it really into every aspect of the organization's work, approaching it comprehensively for all ages. And interesting, I want to note that it was founded, and I think this is a nuanced point, but important, founded not to provide education on topics of agriculture, but on topics of interest to agriculture. And so let me share a little bit about that through this quote from Minnie. When those interested in the development of the program met at the National Convention in St. Paul, we threw our ideas, suggestions, and experiences into a common cauldron. Education there must be before cooperation is possible. And this speaks to, again, why that education lies at the bottom of that triangle with cooperation legislation on the other two sides. She goes on to say, education in cooperation, of course, first and all the time. But also, since we live in an ever-changing world and are subject to the laws of the land, and since our lives are at all times affected by the existing social and economic conditions, education in the problems that confront humanity is essential. I think that's important to note. You know, there's nothing in here about ag education as we might typically think of it, right? That when we were founded, of course, most of the kids were already farmers. But education on topics related to the challenges, not just of agriculture, but of all people, is sort of where we found our niche, our work. And there's another aspect of that education that I want to share. An interesting example, in the early days of the education program, there was a speech contest. It was known as the Minuteman Speech. And as I understand, it was inspired by C.C. Talbot's experience of being limited to a 4-minute address at a Republican convention at which he spoke. Years later, though, Chester Graham shared this reflection, and he said and he was a national junior leader and went on to do a lot of other leadership work in the Farmers Union. Really interesting history. He was a Quaker. He went to Oberlin College. So a liberal arts thinker, and I think Farmers Union's got a lot of those, incidentally. And he said, one of the embarrassing experiences of my life came on my first attendance at a national Farmers Union convention. I was asked to be a judge in a contest when for years I had been teaching that cooperation, not competition, is the way of human progress. I had quit using contests, both in education and recreation. And I bolded those because we've talked a lot about education, and I'm hoping if we have time, Tom's going to speak a little bit to recreation and its role in this organization, including at conventions. Chester Graham went on, from my viewpoint, the adoption of the Achievement Award policy and the absence of all contests is one of the most important and strongest features of the Farmers Union Junior program. So, certainly some contests and some competition have become a part of the organization in other ways over the years. But I think at the core, that notion that the youth activities are open to all, that everyone can be celebrated. And we do this through the Torchbearer Award, which some of you may be familiar with, that everyone can really succeed because they're participating and they're engaged. And that's what we want to celebrate. So now, as a past member of the National Youth Advisory Council, or NIAC, which is a group elected each year at our All States camp, and which as part of their role serves as at the National Convention. You see them out on the policy floor, they're helping out behind the scenes. So as someone who grew up in that, I can share what an impact it made on me as a young Farmers Union leader to really see the continuity of education played out in that way. So I'm pleased to add that since my time on NIAC, the annual responsibilities of that leadership group have been expanded to include attending a national fly-in in Washington, D.C. So in this way, the education experience includes all aspects of Farmers Union. We learn about cooperation as one of the core topics at our camp program. We experience civic engagement, aka legislation, in action when we go to the fly-in, and we see organization in action at the convention. And reflecting back on that slide that Tom had up earlier that featured all of those words, there's one left. And I would dare say that all of these things help us to agitate, or as the late John Lewis would say, to get into good trouble when the need arises. So I think that there's this great connection between how the convention is sort of a microcosm, of the education work we do. It reaches all ages. It covers all kinds of different topics. And it isn't just for young people. And I want to turn it back over to Tom to talk about a kind of a unique program that he was involved in a number of years ago. Whoops, go back one here.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Just real briefly, we always kind of tend to think about education on youth, but it really spans the whole gambit. And one interesting project that came about with brainchild of Victor Ray back in the 1980s, the National Endowment for the Humanities and Farmers Union teamed up to look at farm issues and farming through the perspective of humanities. And it's called the American Farm Project. What was unique about it, it involved farm couples, and they attended conventions too. I mean, that was all part of it. And we tackled these things. So here, a lot of these people never had the opportunity for youth education, but we just keep providing opportunity after opportunity. You might recognize some of these people. That's kind of the reason I threw a slide in. On the left is Dale and Thea Von Ruden, Tom and Carol Bangs. Next to them, I'm in the back, then Don and Alice Waits, and then from North Dakota, Terry and Janet Jacobson, Bill Thompson, Dennis Nanrali, and of course, Virgil and Jan coaches. So let's go on from that. I guess from that standpoint one of the things we all learn in education is that, the big changes and the changes we make are what we make in our communities. And that's how you change the world, is you start at home. So, okay, 1915 convention, I thought I'd just briefly tell you a few of the fun ones. This is actually the Kansas Farmers Union Convention in 1915. And you can see, as I said earlier, how a lot of these state conventions were actually larger than the national conventions. This is the one that Woodrow Wilson showed up in town in Topeka, Kansas, and we were supposed to exit the auditorium so he could speak, but we just all stayed sitting. So we got the ear of President Wilson. Once again, the early meetings, like I said, some of them are held in secret than they were early on. Some of the funny things that would happen, and I think it was in the 1935 or 6 convention, that one had the other panorama. Illinois Farmers Union had actually 2 state organizations because they had split and had a faction, had some issues there. And one of them got expelled from the convention. But the next day, somebody snuck around the back side and found a window into the basement, and they crawled through the window to get back in the convention, which I think is just amazing. And in Kansas, and I think in 1917 convention in Wichita, the editor of a local paper wanted to come into the meeting. They wouldn't let him in. So he found a way to crawl up in the attic so he could spy. And lo and behold, he fell through the ceiling into the convention. So, and there's just many stories like that. Let's move on because I want to leave a little bit of time for questions too, hopefully. The Pirate Recreation. By the way, this photograph was in our Chicago convention. The gentleman on the right was Jim Patton, our national president. On the left was, I think, Walter Reuther with United Auto Workers. But one thing we always have done in conventions for many years have incorporated some kind of recreation. And it goes back to Chester Graham when he defines recreation. And, you know, he does it so well. He talked about, well, for example, he said, you need to understand the difference between entertainment and recreation. And he said, you know, entertainment is when you watch a ball game, recreation is when you participate, when you play. And I think that's true in Farmers Union conventions. We participate. And that word recreation, he talked about how you go to the root, it's recreation, recreate yourself. You fix something that's broken. And I believe Farmers Union does a fantastic job of that. You know, we get together at conventions and do things, and some of it, there's some pure recreation, or, you know, some regular recreation, but then there's some pure recreation. So you never want to discount. I mean, I think our organization is just so amazing about how it just draws people in, and people get to participate. And, you know, when you go to the convention, not only do you bring what you have at home, but it gives you something to take home. It reminds me of a poem that I found in the early Farmers Union paper, and I'm just going to quick read it. It's short. It's on cooperation, but I think it really would apply to our conventions too. And it goes like this: you have $1, I have $1, we swap. Now you have my $1 and I have your $1. We're no better off. You have an idea, I have an idea, we swap. Now you have 2 ideas and I have 2 ideas. Both are richer. What you gave, you have. What you got, I did not lose. And this is cooperation. And I just think that reminds me so much of the conventions. My first convention was in 1979, so I've been to about 40 of them. And it just keeps, I just keep being drawn back to it. Let's go ahead and go to that last slide, because we'll kind of wrap this thing up a little bit. And once again, there's Charlie Barrett, who was our national president. He's the one that really got Farmers Union organized and going. And I always like that headline, harmony and enthusiasm, which is true most of the time. But, you know, it is true basically all the time. And the other thing, the other quote that I really liked from Charlie Barrett was, he said, we make better neighbors when we get together. And Kathy and I were speaking of this a little bit earlier. We talked about, you know, you look at that quote, you know, and he didn't say we both get wealthier or we both make our farms larger. No, we make better neighbors. And I think that gets to the very core of what we are and who we are. And the other thing I just want to briefly mention before I kick it back to Kathy, just briefly on the wrap up, or a little bit of wrap up, is that, you know, we've got to understand that we live in a life of cycles on our farms. We watch the seasons, we watch life and death with animals. We see all these things come to fruition. We see things die, things come to life, and so on and so forth. And our conventions are cyclical. I mean, everything we do kind of follows the cycles of life. So anyway, I think I'm going to stop with that and I think Kathy could do a lot better job of maybe pulling it all together. But but that's kind of the stories that I want to tell about convention. I have a lot more, but that what time allows. So Kathy, why don't you kind of pull together what I kind of fumbled on there?
Oh, no, it's great, Tom. I mean, and I learned a lot of this stuff from you, and I'm just so pleased to be able to share it with you today and with everyone. You know, like Tom said, when we were reflecting on this, we intentionally put that slide about recreation at conventions near the end for that very reason of, you know, the philosophical approach to recreation in Farmers Union being the notion of recreating and renewal. And that there are ways that we do that when we come together, or if we do it this way, at least we have a sense of it. And that, you know, a lot of the best parts of our convention experiences over the years, in spite of some of the shenanigans or some of the behind the scenes stuff that happened in those early years and probably to some degree since then, is that it really convenes hearts and minds in the work. I love the notion that the annual meeting isn't just a business meeting. It's not transactional, right? It doesn't go back to that, you have a dollar, I have a dollar, we swap. If you note that quote from Charlie Barrett that's here on the screen, you know, again, as Tom said, you know, it's not we make more money when we do business well, although we needed to do that as farmers as well, right? But there's a sense that if we have good relationships, if we understand each other's motivations, we will all do better. And an example of that, and some of you may have heard this being spoken of lately with all of the division and sort of deep rifts and highly partisan culture that we have right now. Someone pointed a number of, because this has been going on for some years now, but they pointed to the fact that historically, DC legislators lived in DC. You know, they took an apartment or they bought a house and they were there for much of the year. And what that meant is they also interacted with each other. So even across the aisles, you know, people went to barbecues, people got invited over for coffee. They saw each other, you know, out at the cultural events happening around town. Their children may have gone to school together, right? So they had an experience of being neighbors. And as airfare got more affordable, as legislators decided they wanted to spend more time back in their with their constituent geographies, that relationship of neighborliness went away a little bit. And it's not the only reason, but it may suggest suggest us to think about that a little bit, about how the ways in which we come together, even in casual ways, even with the people we don't always agree with, builds bonds, you know, builds a community of shared experience that then when the time comes to do the work, when the time comes to have the hard conversations, we already have relationships of trust, of mutual respect. And that's really, I think, what makes a good Farmers Union convention so successful, right? We don't always agree. We do bring differing ideas from lots of different backgrounds, lots of different kinds and sizes of farms. But because we have spent time in relationship and fellowship with each other, because we spend some time in recreation, recreating our interpersonal and personal space, we do better together, and we are able to solve those problems in a way that's more sustainable, that takes more voices into consideration, and that hopefully lets everyone win a little bit in that spirit of compromise. So with that, I think we are open to some questions. We've got a little time left. I see there's some pretty robust conversation in the chat and maybe some Q&A that we can share. And Tom and I just both want to really thank you for spending this time with us. So some questions.
Thanks, Tom and Kathy, for diving into some of the rich history and sharing some of the stories about how we've gathered in the past. If it works for you, I'll read off a couple of the questions that have come in. Here's one from Heidi Secord. I think you mentioned earlier on some of the state organizations and state divisions of Farmers Union that once operated but aren't in existence today. One question was, what years did Louisiana Farmers Union operate? And maybe on that note, just a little more about other state divisions that aren't active these days.
I can answer that. Louisiana was real early on, actually a couple times. I'd say 1903 or 4. And a lot of Farmers Union started in the South and kind of spread east towards Florida in cotton country, because we were all about cotton. And that's a story in itself. We were exporting cotton until World War I, until the Germans started shooting our boats out of the water. And then it moved up through tobacco country, and then it came up into the Midwest in the teens. Now, going back to Louisiana, it was twice. Or at least twice. They grew up, they got going, they faded away. And then in the 1940s, late 30s and 40s, we got in and we really started working with the Cajun population and Black population. Just a fascinating story with the lily bulb growers and so on and so forth. Clinton Clark's story could be a program in and of itself. I mean, he was death threats for signing Black farmers up. So yeah, Louisiana, really every state has come and gone. Kansas has lost its charter once or maybe twice. Most every Oklahoma has, North Dakota has, everybody. It ebbs and flows with leadership. And that's what Barrett was the great guy. He knew how to find leadership and put leadership in place. And that's why leadership training and education is so critical. So yeah, and we started in cotton country, ended up in the grain country. In the teens, Nebraska and Kansas were the top two. We had over 100,000 members at one time, Nebraska did. So back and forth, back and forth. So yeah, there's a ebb and flow, but most of it has to do with getting the right leadership in the right place.
Thanks for that. I know I've heard that question around just being around the country and in years past on Capitol Hill when we talked to legislators, just wondering about the history of different state organizations. So that's always good to share with them. Another question came in, and thanks everybody for the great chat discussions going on, but the story about the Farmers Union plane and how the FAA may have gotten involved, perhaps due to some political actions, I guess. There was some discussion about that on the chat. I was wondering if you could shed any more light on that too.
Well, this was shared with me with an old-time organizer who's still around, by the way. But we had that plane and we were using the dickens out of it. And I'll just say it, during the Nixon years, we apparently didn't see eye to eye. And we can't really say that they did it, but it was odd that our plane would be just continually grounded. I mean, we got to do an inspection. We got this, we got that. And we couldn't keep it in the air. We couldn't afford to keep the pilots. We couldn't afford to keep the plane. So we finally got rid of it. By the way, though, airplanes, different state organizations had small airplanes. I know North Dakota had one. They'd fly around probably in the 50s and into the 60s. It was kind of a trendy thing in the 60s and early 70s, the flying farmers thing. So yeah, and transportation to conventions, of course, obviously in the early days was by rail and train. Barrett talked about how one year he traveled like 43,000 miles in a train. So anyway, it's just fantastic story.
Thanks, Tom. So here's a question about some of the other organizations outside of Farmers Union that collaborated closely with with NFU and with Farmers Union at different points. I think this is particularly the case across the northern tier, but I guess other groups have done this as well. The question is, what was the main reason for the American Society of Equity to collaborate with NFU, and what brought the two groups together, and how did they work together? Okay,
we were formed about 30 days apart. And both of them were founded by newspaper editors. And if you understand farm organizations, it usually started by a newspaper editor because they were going to sell newspapers. And that's how people create information. So even some people joined because they'd say, okay, join Farmers Union. And by the way, you'll get this newspaper once a month. And so they, well, I'll do that, But the American Society of Equity, and we were really similar. The only difference is the equity would not allow but they'd allow non-farmers to be members. And we were real stringent. In fact, Newt Gresham, our founder, about 2.5 years after we started the organization, got expelled because he wasn't a farmer. We expelled our own founder. The American Society of Equity kept growing, and Wisconsin Farmers Union grew out of the equity. And when you start putting all this together with the cooperatives and the movements, like there were four. In the 1920s, there were four. There was a Northwest Organizing Committee, Northeast, Southwest, Southeast, but the Northwest was considered just what what do you call Farmers Union industry states: Montana, South Dakota, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. That was the Northwest Territory. And that grew out of the American Society of Equity. It grew out of the Equity Cooperative Exchange, which was a co-op. Then Thatcher was the bookkeeper, but Ricker, with this wonderful editor, came out. He was the editor of a paper called the Farm, something. Anyway, put this thing together. So they finally joined up with us, and Farmers Union, well, all these farm organizations kind of morphed, but it took actually cooperation between organizations and the cooperative movement, which is a lot longer story, but how this all came together wasn't by accident. Charlie Talbot of North Dakota was just a wonderful speaker and wonderful organizer. And that's how that part of our organization grew, and other parts too. I mean, it's not just there, but it's all about organization. And he said, he goes, you know, Barrett always said, you need to organize the hearts first, and then you can organize the people. And then Talbot says, you don't pay your dues out of your pocket, you pay them out of your head. I like that one.
Kathy, I see you're off mute. Did you have something on the Society for Equity?
I had noticed a question, I think it was from Michelle Miller, about the Federation of Southern Co-ops. And Mike, you may actually be able to speak to the relationship there a little bit better than I can, but I can just share that Federation of Southern Co-ops is an amazing organization down in the Southeast. I remember being at the Rally for Rural America on the National Mall in the year 2000. I got to volunteer as an event marshal, which was very exciting, but I remember a huge contingent coming from the Federation to join with us in solidarity at that event. And I know the relationship goes back a lot further, and I know there are some new ways in which NFU and the Federation of Southern Cooperatives is working together today. So I don't know, Mike, I don't want to put you on the spot if you can share any of that, but that's a great connection.
Certainly, yeah, and thanks for that question. And the earlier, well, I guess it was late 2020, we've put together a series of webinars on cooperative education and just continuing in the virtual environment for that. And the Federation of Southern Co-ops played a part in much of that, and we're looking forward to doing a lot more work there too. So it's exciting to find ways to work with other organizations that might have a footprint in parts that in places we don't right now. And I guess another question on other organizations too, looking back a ways, was on the Nonpartisan League. What are the ties between Farmers Union and the NPL?
Well, my understanding is the NPL pretty well wrecked Farmers Union's first organizational efforts in North Dakota. I mean, it split them up. I mean, and NPL, I'm not an expert in that area, but Farmers Union was going in North Dakota. They had their first charter in 1915, went a couple, 3 years, and you know, Gladys Talbot Edwards, who, you know, from North Dakota, or one of our education directors, always talked about all that time period and how rough it was. And it kind of reminds you almost of today. She would talk about how they got so deeply involved in politics. And this is what happens when you get politics too deeply involved in an organization. Barrett speaks to this beautifully. I should write on this, but she said, we'd go to meetings, and she goes, it was terrible. She goes, neighbor would not talk to neighbor. She goes, it just blew us apart. She goes, we just quit having meetings because nobody was civil enough to talk to each other. I mean, so yeah. So that we went through that spell. This Farmers Union story is just incredible. I mean, how when you start to delve into it, it takes a long time. And I'll back up. I don't want to just cut that short, but on the Black involvement in Farmers Union, understand that Farmers Union grew out of the Farmers Alliance. There was a Northern Alliance and a Southern Alliance. The Southern Alliance was segregated, the Northern wasn't. So we had this battle, but we always, even though we had it in our bylaws that Blacks could not be members, and that was until 1933. In 1921, Kansas sent a Black delegate to the convention, which caused quite a stir. So we've got, and I've got a set of bylaws from the North Carolina Negro Farmers Union, which is a parallel organization to us. So race and just that has always been around.
Thanks, Tom.
I just
one more
wanted
question.
to.
Go ahead, Kathy.
Well,
Please.
I was curious. I did see a question from Doug O'Brien from the National Cooperative Business Association, NCBA, CUSA International. Great to have you with us, Doug. And I don't know, Tom, if you know the answer to when National Farmers Union, or maybe Mike, you know, that when the National Farmers Union got connected to CUSA, the predecessor organization, the Cooperative League of the USA, and because there's a great history there, and folks may not know, and I'll use this opportunity to mention it, that the term care package actually comes from that organization, and Farmers Union had a role there. That CARE was an acronym standing for the Cooperative for American Remittances to Europe. And CUSA at the time was part of bringing together a whole group of farm groups, including the National Farmers Union, labor groups, faith groups, to figure out how to get food drops to the starving of Europe after World War II. And today that organization still functions as an NGO, doesn't have the cooperative piece anymore, but it's an important part of our story and an interesting tidbit, a trivia bit that I think is a great story to share. But I don't know the exact date, and I'm not sure if either of you do.
Well, I would speculate it's obviously in Patton's time. He was president from 40 to 66, and Patton was a wonderful leader in so many ways. But what he did was he empowered people to have a vision greater than their own farm and outside their community while building their community. And he was so powerful in that. And then we got involved with CARE. We got involved with all these other organizations we helped create. Some of them we worked together with others. If you look at Patton and a lot of his works, I mean, he did a lot of international stuff. He's the one that brought us from kind of the horse and buggy organization into the quote modern world in a tough time, World War II.
Okay, one last question, and I was going to close up shop, but I saw there was a question from Diane Thierry, and I can't go without asking this question. We all know the triangle plays a big role in Farmers Union values and insignia and all that. Of course, cooperation, education, and legislation. But what date did the triangle finally come to be? When did it really enter into the picture? And how has it changed over the years?
Tom, I got to let you take that one. I don't know.
1930s, I'd say about 31 or 32. You know, if you look at the old newspapers, you know, I call them the headers across the name, it said organization, cooperation, education. It did not say legislation. And so that was where we started with. And this goes into a deeper issue back when farm programs first come into play. Cooperatives and the cooperative movement was so powerful. We were really on a roll because there were basically no farm programs in the 20s, or very little of a farm program. Mary Hagan was vetoed 3 times, I believe. But we had a big internal rift in Farmers Union when FDR come out with the AAA program. And some people are saying, we don't like that. We want to do it through our cooperatives. Some say, well, let's do it legislatively. So yeah, there's a distinct place in there for that. But that emblem, that legislation got tacked on. So if you go back to the first 30 years, it's going to say organization, education, cooperation. Now it's legislation, education, cooperation.
And if I can just add, what I think is sort of interesting about that is in organizing, as I understand, there are 2 notions. One, the notion of power over, and one, the notion of power with. And what I think is really fascinating is that Farmers Union figured out that both were really important and incorporated both into their mission, right? So power over is the notion in Farmers Union sense, I think, of making sure there's good legislation and dealing with it when there isn't, and addressing that power that, whether it's government or whether it's corporate monopoly, managing that power over dynamic by enacting good legislation. Power with, of course, is the story of cooperatives and the ways in which everyday people can come together at this sort of lateral level in a horizontal sense, rather than the kind of the vertical of the power structures, but rather with each other as equals to get the things done that we might not be able to do over here, right? So I just think that that's a really great way to encapsulate who we are and what we do.
15 seconds, Mike, I'm sorry. But the legislative part of Farmers Union, their main goal early on was to make cooperative law universal standard and work for everything. That's where all of legislative efforts were initially.
Thanks for these great insights and just a fantastic session. And thanks to everybody who's been part of this today with all the different comments and questions that have been coming in. And again, just thank you so much to Tom and Kathy for your time that you put into preparing for this and for sharing your knowledge and perspective. If there were things you particularly liked or want to share this with other people, again, I encourage everyone to share this session. It'll be available on our convention website, nfu.org/convention. And before we close, don't forget that there's another panel that starts in half an hour. You'll use the same link to join that. And that, again, will be about climate-focused rural economic development. Should be pretty interesting. And we've got a great panel lined up there, too. Also, don't forget, next week, there are 2 more webinars that you've been registered for if you're on here right now. Both of them are on Friday, February 26th. At 2 p.m. on Friday the 26th, we'll have a session on enhancing competition and resiliency in livestock markets. Our speakers are set to be a couple of influential lawmakers. We'll get more details out about that, but looking forward to that discussion. And then at 3:30 on Friday the 26th, we'll have a deep dive into the role of biofuels in a new Congress and administration. And that'll include a couple of key players in the biofuels industry and how that helps farmers. So again, you can stay up to date on all of our convention webinars and topics on our webpage. And of course, our main portions of our convention will be held on March 1st and 2nd. Delegates will be receiving a special link to join in on that. And the general public is invited to watch on our Facebook Live on March 1st and 2nd. More details will be released on that. But once more, thanks again. Thanks, Tom and Kathy. Thank you all for joining in, and have a great rest of your day. Hope you can join us again in about half an hour. Thanks.
Thank you.